Hi, welcome to this Open Security Summit in September 21. Ben is going to give us a follow-up update on this really, really exciting project he's been working on, and actually that we're creating a new OSS project around it. We're going to call it Control Framework Maps, and Ben is going to give us an update that you can then see here, but also we'll publish on YouTube and package it up in a much easier to consume way. Over to you, Ben.
Great. Okay. Thanks, Dennis. Thanks for inviting me along. And what I want to do is I'm going to give a the risk of boring people. I'm just going to set the context. It's been a while since I last presented on this, and I just want to bring people up to speed with what's been going on over the last couple of years. So, I mean, essentially, what this is a community effort for a group that's quite wide. It's a supply chain for media and entertainment. And so everyone would recognize the big players like a Disney or a Warner Brothers or an Amazon Studios or a Netflix, but this also encompasses about 7,000 vendors all the way down to the composers sitting in their garage. So there's a lot of people who kind of own the content and make the content. There's also an increasing interest because media is such a heavy asset when you're moving it around. The cloud platforms are really interested, and there's a whole ecosystem around different software vendors on that cloud. Traditionally, this has been, when you go back to the film days, this was done by a bunch of people who were specialized in production, post, and distribution. So you'd film the film on film, you'd digitize it, you then put it in an edit suite. Someone would edit it, someone would do the sound, someone would do the color, and then you create multiple versions, which then go out to all the different territories around the world. So with language tracks, with dubbing, all these different changes, with compliance checks, so you take out all the bikinis for Saudi Arabia. So there's a bunch of people who are quite used to moving these big, heavy files around and then doing work on it. You've got a new kind of cohort of native cloud software vendors that are coming to the fore, and they're leveraging some of the cloud infrastructure, so you can now build a lot of this distribution and production infrastructure on the cloud. And then finally, you've got a bunch of these cloud-specific automated compliance tools, and they're also part of this community. So really what content owners want to do is they want to protect those assets, their crown jewels, as they move through these different stages. And quite often they're sending out original high-quality assets out to some of these different vendors to do the work. So what we're looking at here is how you get a common set of controls for this industry. And this originally started around a thing called the Trusted Partner Network. And when I was at the British Film Institute, I was creating a set of controls. Sorry, just checking the chat. Well, I was basically creating a VOD player, and with that VOD player, I had to go and talk to different studios, and each of the different studios had their own set of questionnaires, and it was incredibly time-consuming to answer each of their questionnaires. Kind of the same questions in a different order, but you had to answer them in a specific way. And each studio had their own auditors, their own internal things. So the idea here was to get a single set of controls that meant that you could have, you could share that across the industry. And that way, one vendor does an audit for Disney, and then that's applicable for Warner Brothers or Paramount. So that was the original intent, and this is probably going about 7 years. But really what's happened over time is that the audience and all the revenues have moved online. So increasingly, streaming is the way that that people consume content, and they consume it on devices, other devices than the TV, and they consume it on a movie theater, and they consume it in shorter bites. So alongside that, there's been this consolidation of the digital production. So previously people shot into film, now everything is shot on digital, and all the metadata is then brought up, and a lot of it is now moving into kind of virtual environments with CGI, visual effects. So there's been this rapid shift from away from those traditional processes to these cloud-based workflows, and that means you need a different set of skills. So the people that were used to handling film or used to doing physical security don't necessarily have the skills for dealing with that cloud infrastructure. And the way we've looked at this is really as a kind of an evolutionary curve. So everyone can start off with very basic kind of hygiene stuff, but really what you want to do is to move up from that hygiene into some simple checklists. And here in the UK, there's a thing called the Digital Production Partnership, and they have 43 controls in a spreadsheet. And then when you move up to the US studios, they're using today a set of controls from TPN, now CDSA, which are kind of these professional auditors coming and doing an annual check. And then as you evolve up, you get to things like Netflix, who've got a very robust kind of zero trust approach for the way they do security. Right now, we're not regulated, so we're not like SEC or HIPAA, where you go to prison if you get it wrong. But if you look at GDPR and CCPA, there are already significant financial penalties. If you're someone with the revenues of Amazon, 4% a year makes a massive difference. So we're moving up this curve, and we just want to try and make sure we drag all those vendors with us. Because this is the issue. You know, a lot of the conversation, you know, this is a group of people who are in the community, security community. And if you look in the studios, you know, and across the supply chain, you know, studios, although they are by far the biggest barking dog, they're a very small number of people. So someone like Disney might have 40 people in their security team, and 40,000 people in media and entertainment. But across the ecosystem, you've got a range of vendors that are probably 7,000 of those vendors. So how do you make something that is the bread and butter of the day to day for a security expert sitting inside a major studio? How do you make that relevant to someone who's just trying to do a bit of business, which is putting Spanish, Portuguese languaging tracks on a piece of content? So how do we make sure that we can make this relevant, not just to the top of that pyramid and down to the bottom? And what we're seeing here, I've referred here to NIST, but there's an increasing, with the solar winds kind of hitting the press, there's a lot of focus now on how do you make your supply chain protected, because otherwise what happens is you may be secure up in your medieval keep up here, but if the landscape, your entire territory is open to attack, then you have a problem. So basically, I inherited a whole bunch of standards. I inherited probably 900 custom standards written for the media industry for cloud application and cloud security, and it was obviously going to be one of those unending tasks to try and keep those up to date and keep tracking. And so I had an epiphany, which was, instead of trying to author and create a completely custom set of controls for the media industry, why not map them from existing controls? So we took a selection of original Cloud Security Alliance and OWASP, and then we added the Center for Internet Security. And it's really trying to say, if you can pick on those open standards, those industry horizontal standards that apply to a wide range of industries, and you can select the right controls from those, then all you need to do is maintain a mapping to that group of controls. And as there are changes, you can reflect on them, but it means you don't have to author those controls anymore. You can refer to those and then apply them in the media sector. The other thing that kind of triggered this was talking to the cloud platforms. And if you look at someone like Amazon Web Services, in the last calendar year, they've released over 2,700 new products. So if you think about the time it takes just to read the marketing information about those products, let alone understand the technical implementation, let alone understand the security best practice, it's a huge thing to cover. And some of the vendors in the supply chain have got multi-cloud, so they're dealing with few of them with all 5 of the cloud platforms. So the idea was to try and make this more to make it easier and cheaper for vendors to apply this, was to take the cloud platforms, all their products, and align them to these frameworks. And we've had good traction. We've got Google, Amazon, IBM, Azure, Alibaba, all participating in this effort to take their products and map them out. Now, the key thing here is to make sure there's no extra effort, but they already have, in speaking to Azure, they've already done a lot of this internal mapping. So we can make it so that at the point that someone wants to apply a product in their tech stack, they can refer quickly to that best practice. And when it comes to audit, it means you can then refer back to the best practice, check it's up to date, and see it's been applied. So that really is the kind of central premise, is to try and remove the need to map those controls, to author individual controls, just do mapping. And secondly, to try and make sure that everything in your tech stack has a best practice you can apply. when this initiative started out, it's really around app and cloud. And they were seen as distinct and separate. And you said, well, you do your application, you do your cloud, and you're fine. But in my belief, you've actually, this is the wrong model. You have multiple applications in that tech stack. You always have integration code that basically exchanges data between those applications. In the context of media, you might have something like RightsLine, which is tracking the rights for a particular piece of content. You might have an application like the Banjo, which is doing the scheduling for that media content. You might have another application like OwnZones, which is doing Now Atelier, which is doing the IMF distribution, the formatting, or Meta.how, which is doing the metadata. So all of those have got to come together. And if you're doing this on cloud, you'll have infrastructure as code, you'll have CloudFormation, you have TerraGrunt, you have serverless, which is building your stack on the cloud. And this really, for me, is the attack surface, which is this entire universe. You've got to check everything and make sure that everything here is correct. So to try and address that, what we've looked at is, and I've talked about reducing that controls maintenance effort with that mapping. What we've tried to do is kind of paint a map here, and I'll talk about where we are on that map. But you can see we've got some control sets here which have overlapping controls. And we've had a committee that's gone through of technical experts, security experts drawn from media and entertainment, experience in different areas. We've then looked at that and said, from that, what are the most important controls? We've tried to organize those controls into these 4 pillars so they're more relevant to vendors. And then we're applying this to the current audit process. And then what we want to do is extend that into this best practice and extend it into a way of publishing a template so that a small vendor that wouldn't necessarily be able to afford or have the resources to understand this can embed this control-driven process into their day-to-day. They can have an operations process which then refers these procedures, and the procedures satisfy the controls. They can track incidents, they can track defects, they can look at meetings, and it means that you basically have a set of information here that if an auditor comes in or if a studio wants to look at the security posture, they can see immediately what's going on. So that covers off the process side of things. The other key element here, though, is around the people. And I've heard studios say, hand on heart, we're going to inspect all the code for our vendors. And anyone who's anyone really understands that inspecting all the code is a nonsense, because you inspect the code, and as soon as you've signed the piece of paper that says this code was inspected, you're then immediately in a situation where the next release could invalidate all of that. So I think unless you look at the people and the process that are involved in that, you make sure that that is solid, you're never going to be able to check the quality of what's going on. So we've talked here about the control set. We've talked about the collateral, this kind of secure config guidelines, this best practice, the process, updates. So obviously we've done the mapping originally against CCM version 3 and CIS version 7. And CCM has just released this year version 4. CIS is at version 8. So we need to now map against those changes. But over time, what we see is a publishing of changes to those control standards so that you can bring those through automatically and then check that you've which ones where there's been a change, where it's relevant. And the second set of updates is really around the media ISAC, where you've got media and entertainment ISAC, where you have a bulletin board, a kind of closed network broadcast to people in the media industry to say, here is a vulnerability that affects the media industry. And so that threat model really applies to the risk register. We talked about people. And then the final thing which we need to wrestle with is, how do you change the audit process, which is how do you change this? So instead of it being a professional audit once a year, that what you're changing this to is a set of automated checks. You give people the tools to check themselves. And you also change that audit role to being something that's continuously helping people audit and deliver. So I'll just pause at this point. Has anyone got any questions? Because I realize I've been talking non-stop for about 20 minutes. No, I will. I'll carry on. We've got some time for
Actually,
this.
Ben, I have a question, but just to clarify to everybody, all of this stuff that you're talking is open source, right?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, basically, we're basing this approach on the control specs that have come from control standards that have come from CIS, CSA, and OWASP. So each of those set of controls is basically open source. So we're referring to them and saying those are the sources we're going to. So, obviously, what we need to make sure is we don't break anyone's business model here, but we're trying to make this so that this is inclusive. But I believe, and Dennis and I have had this conversation, that what we're doing here has applicability for other supply chains, because if you've got the mappings for your controls with CSA and CIS and OWASP, that could be applied to any industry and any. So we're trying to get this working for media and entertainment, but it can only help the industry if we get this running in a way against those controls.
Yeah, and I think that's where the really interesting opportunity is. That I think the fact that you're working with that industry gives you a big focus. But this is something that basically what you talk about is how do you get smaller teams to basically leverage these security controls, but also be able to answer the question, what am I doing for these big security standards, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And what we're hoping here is talking about things like how do you translate from a SOC 2 audit if you've now got a different type of audit. So if you look at the underneath on these mappings, if we can traverse that graph, we should be able to relate one audit to another and say how this stuff works. So as with any conversation with Dennis, it always gets back to graphs and maps. So I'm just going to jump forward. So the way we see this happening in practice is, well, we've got a first stage, which is to kind of modernize the control framework within the existing application, which is a proprietary document library funded by the major studios, where vendors pay for an audit and they can look at those, and a studio can look at those audits. But what we're looking to is extend that into something that can be published out to a small vendor. But what I've illuminated here is the idea of how that would work in practice. So say you've got a software house, a 20-man team that have got their Jira Confluence internally where they're building software. They should have an operational process. Now that might be that they are delivering software, in which case you've got your secure design, you've got your workflow. Each of those workflows should be decomposed into a set of procedures. And those procedures can then satisfy the control you've got. So when an auditor comes in, they can look at the workflow and say, is that what they're actually doing? Look at the underlying procedures and then check that each procedure satisfies the control. And when we did this rough sort, 900 something controls is way too many to fit in anyone's head. So what we said is, let's reduce this down to a meaningful set of controls, something like 200 to 300 controls. So 40 is way too small. It's just way too high level. You need something that you can audit against. The number that we seem to found consensus on is somewhere between 200 and 500. So what we've done is, the primary control, one of these might be a CSA control. You might have a CIS or two CIS controls and an OWASP control underneath here. We're going to track changes to all of those, but really what the vendor's procedure has to do is satisfy that primary control. We've selected that as encompassing these other equivalent controls. That procedure may well also be linked to a piece of best practice, depending on your tech stack. So we'd expect the vendor to write their workflow against a template, make sure that every control is satisfied. And then for every product they're using their tech stack, have they got the best practice? And when they apply that best practice, have you got evidence of them doing that? And that means when an auditor comes in, they can see, is this the latest best practice? Is this the latest control? Is this the procedure up to date? And they can track, if they're using something like Jira or Confluence, they can see, are people actually engaging? Or is this unfortunately, the normal exercise that a lot of people go through with an audit, where they run around like crazy for a month before the audit, they get the audit, and then everyone relaxes for the next 10 months. So it's trying to make this from being that single snapshot into something that is real time. There's another question here around remediation, and Disney had a policy which was no vendor could have any open remediations. And from a personal note, I don't believe that's the right approach, because I think if you look hard enough, you'll always find something wrong. And so there should always be some open remediation. The question is whether it's material to what you're trying to achieve. So if you're writing a contract with that vendor, do you need to mitigate against that risk with this open remediation? And if it's something as serious as they've got unpatched Linux systems open to the internet with tier 1 content on it, then obviously that would be a red flag. But if it's library content, if it's content that's already been seen by the world, and you're just rehashing it for some tertiary market, then that's not such a problem. So in doing this exercise to try and organize these controls, what we did is we took all the 900 controls, and all of them relate to different domains. So there's another map I've got behind this where I kind of visually graph together ISO, CSA, CIS, MPA, and OS. We'll put them all together and try to group them together, because the other problem you have is when you spend too much time looking at security controls, you start to believe that they actually are meaningful to normal people. And most people wouldn't have a clue. They start reading a security control, their eyes roll up the back of their skull. So it's how do you make this relevant to people? And so the approach we've got here is to try and group it into these 5 groups, to say that the management team really care about how they get people on boards, how they train them, how they manage them when they're in post, and how you deal with levers. Looking at the supply chain, what are your contracts you've got? How do you make sure those contracts are, what's the assessments you're doing from a security perspective, the metrics, how do those pieces of, how do those different contracts interoperate? Risk is something that's poorly done generally, I believe, but it's, again, from a small organization, should look at what those risks are and how they manage the risks. And then obviously the policy documentation. From a security professional point of view, it's looking at incidents and audits. And then in the operational tier, you're looking at who can do what with the content, where the content's held, and then we're down to the physical security. So this is stuff like having secure areas, like having cameras, badged access, fences, dogs, all that sort of stuff. And then here are really the new areas. So this is very much the traditional approach for physical security. Although there is some stuff around networks and around hardware, what we've tried to do is group this together into cloud and infrastructure, where there are cloud-specific things around, there may be certain things that are different between the cloud platforms. Each of them have a shared responsibility model, and each of them also handle virtualization in containerizing or in serverless. But then the configuration, it doesn't really matter to me whether you've got a Linux server sitting on your desktop, or it's sitting in a data center, or it's a virtual machine or spun up in the cloud. Each of those should have the same kind of configuration done on. So if you look at these pieces, the change control and the configuration of hardware and software and network, I think those are all things that are invariant. They're the same, that they should be applied. And then you've got cryptography. And then we've taken OWASP, and this is probably the most difficult thing to do, which is take ASVS as a standard, which is very much a narrative document, and break that down into these 3 areas in an arbitrary way. So hopefully by doing this, it means that anyone in an operational role has only got to deal with a smaller set, and it's going to make more sense to them. So we did there's a big effort, probably about 30 people involved for about 18 months. We've done that work. We've reached out to the different open source, the CSA, CIS, and OWASP, and got some feedback. But really, it's we've got now this candidate set that's out there that's published. What we're now looking at is how we take that that kind of mapped control framework, and then and the audit history from previous audits we've got, and deliver that on this shared audit platform. And how then we extend it out into this dotted line stuff, which is how we get these process templates out. And looking further into the future, obviously, how do we look at things like tying together the incident response with the ISAC, where you've got updates on your risk register and incidents, and then making sure this can be linked into these big enterprise tools. So there are lots of tooling, cyber, The venture industry for cyber is massive. There's huge investment going on. Lots of people are making lots of money in this area. And so some of the big companies are stepping into these enterprise tools. We want to make sure that if you're using that enterprise tool, it kind of it's relevant here. But we're really going from what was an annual audit and a very much a static paper report into something that does these real-time updates and this continuous deployment approach. So what's the next steps? We're kind of coming up for 4 or 5 weeks away from launch. We're going to launch with some major content owners, and so people like Amazon Studios, Netflix, Warner Brothers, Paramount, and we're going to, I'm really initially focusing this on features, which means cinema and TV series. And then we're going to try and extend this program from those key vendors into all vendors, go across different regions, and then start looking at other content types, because this applies also to games and brands. So there's a huge market if you're looking for someone like a Disney with Hasbro, with different kind of or Lego with different licensing, and this is all seen as media, seen as intellectual property, but it's how you control it. But the model we've got here is there's a common platform that's been built by a company in the US called ISE. And we have this idea of the hub and spoke model, where all the vendors will be in the hub, and then each of the spokes will have integrations into their own systems. And then we're going to link this into the cloud platforms, this idea of the best practices, but also some of the major applications. And the way I would see this working would be, say your tech stack is EC2 plus S3 plus WAF plus Route 53. Each of those have a security best practice you should apply. And so an auditor would be able to say, I can see that what version you're at, you've got the right best practice that has been applied, tick. You can then leave that alone and focus on the next thing. The next thing up in the stack is an application. And again, each of those applications, something like an Adobe, everyone will be familiar with Adobe Acrobat Reader, but there are video applications like Premiere, there are other ones like Avid or Blackmagic Resolve. Each of those will have their own best practices. So you can apply the best practices for each of those applications. What you're left with is the auditor focusing on the gaps, on the piece of integration, the custom pieces there. And then finally, we're hoping to publish this out in a way that can be consumed by vendors at all scales. So it becomes really quick and easy to do this.
So Ben, can you just expand a bit more on that platform and the structure of it and the format of it?
Yeah, the platform. I mean, when I say platform, it's let me talk about what exists today. What exists today is a custom application on AWS, which is a audit library, and so you can a studio can look at a number of vendors for different services and say, that could be Box for moving files around, or it could be something more specialized like a WriteSign or a Synchronize. They'll look at that, or it could be an AWS or an Azure. They'll look at that and say, is this vendor cleared? When were they last audited for media and entertainment? And they can see their audit report and check what the open remediations are. So that at the moment is if you like, an audit library for those annual audits. But what we're looking to is extend that out into this real-time platform I'm talking about, and then also being able to collate other bits of data. Something like if you get a third-party network check, if you do a penetration test, if there are other data points, to have all that collected together. And that means when a studio looks at a vendor and they're trying to select which vendor to use, they can compare vendors. And when they select a vendor, they've got they've got a trail, an audit trail of what the security posture is.
Well, how is the data maintained at the moment? So each vendor goes in and puts the data in?
Basically, what happens, the vendor fills in a questionnaire. There's a professional audit by an auditor who will go and visit their, the post facility in South Korea, and then they will write a report, and that report is then logged against that location. That's how it works.
Cool. And what are they auditing on? Is that the spreadsheets and or that standard that they published?
All right, so what I've published is a control framework, and that's the amalgamated control framework, but that control set is also within this application. and that's what's being referenced for this questionnaire. So essentially what the questionnaire does is you have a set of controls. The questionnaire, depending on what service you're offering, references the appropriate controls and then asks a set of questions, and then you test, the auditor can then test against those controls when they do the physical audit.
Cool. Is there some sample reports that maybe you can share or they can publish?
Yeah,
that
unfortunately, that's the kind of you can't. I mean, let me see what I can get. There's definitely that's highly sensitive commercial information, so it's doesn't tend to be shared. You can imagine that the vendor will be pretty embarrassed if they have some major remediations. And
no, I'm just saying about sample reports, right? I'm saying.
Oh yeah, no. I'm sure I can get the format for you. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. But I mean, it's a narrative document, and it goes through sections. It's basically a report builder based off those questionnaires. So you can imagine the controls, and then there's a kind of, given the profile of what that vendor service is, the service that vendor is giving, it brings out a set of questions. The auditor then goes and actually uses an iPad and is prompted for those questions and then answers those questions. And those responses get consolidated into a report where you've got the, if you like, the auditor's report. Not, it doesn't have all the questions and all the responses, but it'll have a consolidated report, and then any key remediations that are highlighted will be then broken out, so you can see what the open remediations are, and you'll have then there is a process to close those remediations off.
And is the questions they're using the base of this model that you have?
Well, so the control framework that is currently in use today, it doesn't really encompass properly the cloud platforms, and that's what this effort has been about, is how do we get this ready for the modern age where someone like Netflix is all cloud, everything is cloud.
And I guess one interesting element of this project is that the companies who fill those questionnaires, they eventually should be able to use the mappings they were developing here to basically answer the question, okay, so now I've done this, how much SOC 2, how much BSIM, how much ISO 27000 am I compliant on, right?
Okay, so what I'm hoping is that the vendors will have, instead of answering the questionnaires on an annual basis, they'll have a set of internal processes in a workflow, and each of those procedures are deemed necessary to satisfy a control. So if you're following that process step, you satisfy the control, and you have to have evidence of it. And that means that you are keeping in real time your current security posture against that control framework. So that the control framework may change, there may be a new vulnerability, but it means you're always up to date with what's going on. And when someone wants to look at what you're doing, whether it's an auditor or it's a vendor, so it's a content owner wanting to see what your posture is, they should be able to see what your security posture looks like in real time.
Okay, but where do you? I guess the bit I'm confused. Where do you map that to the ISOs and the SOC 2 and the BSIMs and the base controls?
Okay, so each of these controls we've got from CSA. Let me just actually jump down. I think it's here. Each of these CCM4, for example, has already got these mappings to ISO, to TSC, to CIS, to PCI and NIST. Those two are last year in development. So for each one of these horizontal frameworks, like CIS, you've got those external mappings. So what's interesting there is the emission of OWASP. So that's why I'm keen to try and make sure, because I believe if everyone presents their own, and of course they're going to be subjective mappings of between these control frameworks, you should be able to traverse the graph backwards and forwards between them. And at that point, then you get to the holy grail, which I think what you've alluded to, which is you could take a SOC audit and say, here's my SOC audit, which satisfies these controls. If I now represent this for a different standard, which of these controls are equivalent and have already been answered? So you should be able to take your SOC 2 audit, look at the gap records for another audit, and then just answer those questions. And it's going to be interesting to see how these different orthogonal, sometimes orthogonal control frameworks map to each other, but everyone has their own opinion. What's interesting is when I started in this process, you can map one way very well. If you try and reverse those mappings and map the other way, then you immediately you see where people have lost the will to live and given up mapping. And so I think putting this in a model where you can automatically traverse that graph backwards and forwards, we'll find out where the dead ends are.
Cool, thanks.
So I mean, I realize because I'm starting to choke up here that I've been speaking for a lot. Any questions before I was just going to dive into some more detail on, you know, my experience and some of the lessons I've learned in doing this. All right. One of the things here then on control mapping is consistent IDs. So I had the nightmare task of initially in the spreadsheet, how do you get these things to align? And you've got to be very clean on how you use your version numbers. Otherwise, you find things don't sort in order. It's very difficult to rhyme these. So it's how you represent these consistent IDs. And especially with something like ASVS, which is a narrative document, that's very difficult. So I'm very pleased to see with Mario with his ASVS user stories, which I think there's a talk on later this week, how he's actually getting some you know, actual IDs on how those can be used and how you can automate that to get those consistent IDs. So, and it's breaking what is a something that's been written as a narrative document into something that's granular controls can be automated is quite difficult. So has anyone here looked at OSCAL, the NIST standard around automation? It's a language of how you describe a control in a way that's machine readable. And I think this is going to be a, you know, very interesting development here, which is how we can then start to process some of these controls automatically. Do you mind if we hold 1 second? I'm just going to get a glass of water so I don't choke to death. Hold on.
Yeah, go for it.
And the final thing here is just, you know, looking at it is the kind of the business models here, just making sure that what you're doing is not breaking the business models because everyone has a different business model. Obviously, OWASP is volunteer driven, and but some of the other standards bodies, like ISO, you have to pay for every time you download their standards. How do you make sure these business models overlap together as well, so that you're doing something that can be easily shared?
Or you create something that people can bring their own licenses, right? I think that's the other thing, because the point here is also to future-proof this, right? So if somebody has a proprietary framework, even internally, right? So if you think about it, the other interesting thing is that how do you hook this to the internal platforms and the internal risk models and the internal sort of frameworks that people have developed, right? So. Yes. And then they're going to have the same problem. Somebody could develop a great internal framework, but they're still going to get the same question. How do I map against ISO? How do I map against these other things? How do I fare? Which is where I think is quite interesting to do this and to connect the dots on this one.
And the only people that have really done the mapping, and I've had the pain of doing the mapping, but CCM will have their own mapping, and then that would have been validated. But you get down to individuals doing this. And I think what I'm keen to do is take all those mappings and do a map of the mappings. And then you can see where there are gaps, and you can see where there's things that are subjective. And it's easier to get that kind of common understanding about how these things fit together. Maybe that's a bit ambitious, but I think that's the aspiration.
Yeah.
But
I just to follow up on that one, I think it's important to think about the idea that having those extra frameworks and having those extra connections is what will happen a lot, right, in the real world, right? So it's almost like the fact that we start by scratch by this project by mapping multiple things. I think you need to embrace as a first sort of almost first-class citizen, right? Like first top-level action, which is. Although people will always want, to have a unified, framework, people will arrive at a table with their framework. So even the path to have the unified framework is to first embrace whatever framework they have, and to say, yeah, but you don't have to reinvent the wheel, because we can give you a whole bunch of risk mappings, can give you a whole bunch of data that connects to this common language, right? It's almost like, if you think about it, it's in a weird way, it's the way a lot of parsers work, a lot of static analysis, and a lot of analyze do, which they take a whole bunch of different languages, they bring it to a common representation, and then they do analysis on it. But they make sure they know how to get back to the original modes. And I think this has that potential, which is pretty cool.
Well, that's what I'm hoping. I mean, obviously, I'm not, I'm not necessarily a practitioner in each of these domains. I think the only issue is that there are, there will be people resistant to change because they see their control framework as being their their meal ticket. So it's just making sure that you don't run into too much cultural barriers here.
Yeah, which I think that's why the model should be based on not needing certain buy-in, right? You can
Absolutely.
just do it. Cool.
So one of the things I also looked at here was risk register, and I think this is generally something that's fairly poorly done. And I basically point here to the work that Phil Huggins has done with OSRU, how you pronounce that, and the FAIR Institute. And I don't know if everyone's familiar here with how you do that, but when you look at in a business at risk, generally, you get a foreign currency risk, which would be there's a trading risk, and you'll hedge against that risk. And there's a very easy way of measuring that. You'll have a fire insurance risk, which you'll have. So there are risks in the company which are mitigated against, and there's a very clear kind of there's a big actuarial database. There's a lot of evidence, and people are very the CFO is very conversant in how to measure that and explain those risks. But generally, when I look at cyber risk, it tends to be expressed in red, amber, green. And it's really difficult then to say, I need $1 million, or I need $100,000, or I need $10,000 for the red one, or for the green one, or for the amber one, because what does that mean? So, I would assert that this needs parity with other business risks, and it needs to be set in dollars. And the way that the FAIR Institute do this is they say, basically, that needs to be owned by the business domain to engage with it and say, what's the impact of this event or this event or this event? And then you can run a Monte Carlo simulation, and you can look at this loss exceedance curve I've got on the right here. And then you can use the industry data set to calibrate the frequency. And then your impact times frequency gives you your risk dollars. And then if you spend more than that, you're wasting money. Less than that, you're okay. So this is quite ambitious, but how do you improve people's risk registers for cyber? How do you make sure that this is something that is up there at the board level and looked at in the same way as an insurance risk or as a foreign currency hedge? And I just, I point people at these two links here to have a look at. But also, if you look inside Netflix, who is always quite advanced in this area, for their internal systems, they've done this. They've actually open sourced this. There's a link here. They have a thing called Risk Quant. So they have for their internal processes and systems, they have a way of basically getting the business domain experts to quantify that risk, creating in reality these loss exceedance curves, and using that to judge where the investment should go. I think that's a pretty sophisticated approach. So I think that's something that's quite interesting to me, is how do you start with that narrative risk register, but then how do you assign a value to it, and how do you make that easy to do so that other people can do it? So again, Dennis, I don't know if you've got any experience of this, but this for me is quite important.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And that's that's where a lot of these becomes more real for a lot of the the individuals, right?
Yeah, exactly. So I mean, again, risk register, I'll put some links on here. This is probably, if we had someone like Phil on here, we'd probably talk for the whole hour just about this, but it's something we're cognizant of. And then the other thing, which is, and this is a little more kind of nascent, is this idea of a software bill of materials. So there is a NIST initiative around this, but it's back to this idea of the tech stack, of your layers of your pieces. So making sure you've got a strong foundation, and then probably I should do this the other way up. And then these are the large lumps, and then you get to the integration code, and that's going to be, maybe some small pieces of code. If anyone's ever tried to audit a macro on a spreadsheet, which might be joining two of these sets of data together, you know how tough that is. So it's making sure that you can look across the whole of the stack, and where you can see there's best practice already being applied. It means you can then reduce your effort there, and you don't always just look at the basics. You can start to drill into a bit more detail. And the other bit here is around automated discovery, which is a lot of these. There are loads of tools now that are flashing up alerts to say something's going wrong, and I've been the victim of this myself, where my software has set off a tripwire, and the reality of it is that these it's a false positive, but it's I think it's how do we look at this inventory, and how for each component you're putting together, and going back to your static analysis there, Dennis, it's how do you assure each of those components, and when you've assured that component, how do you assure it in its framework?
Yeah, and I do think that is that connection, right? That is going to be key, right? And we need to know that it's about experience now. Like you said, it's about finding the dead ends, and but getting a good way to understand and map it and connect the dots is going to be critical then.
Good. So I mean, really, I guess I've got I've only left a few minutes for 10 minutes for questions, but I probably kind of thrashed them all to death anyway, the questions. But hopefully this makes a bit more sense, that where we started from, where we're progressing to, and that I'm really happy to collaborate with anyone who's got any other ideas about how we can do this. But the idea would be that what comes out of this is a set of mappings against these frameworks, but I believe each of these then kind of reaches out to other frameworks like ISO, or back to more fundamental things like COBIT and NIST. So it's how do we kind of map the world, and how we build this graph that you can kind of track this equivalence. I'm not sure that's going to be in everyone's interests. Some people maybe want to hold the keys and make this more arcane. But I think we need to keep it so it's open and easy to do.
Yeah, absolutely. I was actually thinking that a couple of good sessions for to do in November, right? So we want to, next summit is in November. It's almost like practical sessions, like how to map this to SOC 2, how to map this framework to ISO, how to go from SOC 2 to ISO through the framework, how to integrate with the risk, the risk tools. I think it'll be good, even if you just pick like 5 of them, right? And just walk through them. Say, okay, let's pick 5 or 10, and then just have that conversation of going, here is this control and how it maps to the others. Because in terms of also creating nuggets to generate community, I think we kind of need to create these kind of 3 to 5 minute little nuggets to show here's one control, and here's the control now represented in these other standards, right? Yeah. And walk through how that works. If you can do it 1 or 2, then it's a bit like DevOps, right? Then you kind of start, iterating.
Yeah, and I guess back to what I said earlier, which is the only people that have had the brain power and the resource, the time to do this mapping have been professionals for each of the frameworks. But I think it's much more important for people who are using these day to day, when they look at these and say, this doesn't add up, this mapping doesn't work, or when I try and traverse graph both ways, there are some inconsistencies. And I think so superimposing all these different mappings together and making the mapping a central part of the control standard, I think is going to make this a much more joined up process, much more useful. But also my experiences with Atlassian, with Jira and Confluence, I think it's quite a good tool for writing a policy document, say in Confluence, and then linking that to a standard, and then having tickets for actions, and you can build your workflows, your compliance workflows there. So I'm keen to make sure this isn't just a kind of like a bare bones set of tools, which is doesn't connect with users, but it's something you can land into a living set of policy documents.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I'm a big fan of Jira, right? So, and then GitHub, and these days there's some interesting graph models. So cool. All right. Any final questions from anybody? And then, if not, I think Ben, I think we can end it, and then we'll publish the video, and let's work on the. So there's a new area now on the site that we're going to create the project.
Yep.
And then actually, I'm going to actually have a session in a bit about it, or at least talk about the projects. So let's evolve it and then share it and see if we can actually consolidate a lot of the information, make it easy to consume, make it easy to share, and for others to contribute.
Great. Thanks, everyone. Speak soon.